Hello, everyone, to our discussion about weaving or blending hospitality into real estate. And just really, it's a discussion around real estate as a service. And in this group, we'll discuss sort of what are the market trends our experts are seeing in the market, the impact of that evolution, that sort of more service-oriented model in terms of investment strategy and asset management or asset investment strategy. And then we'll sort of finally discuss at the end, the weaving of hospitality, and some of those methods and practices into managing real estate. So I want to introduce myself. I'm Sochi, head of IFM and asset services across Asia Pacific for Cushman Wakefield. And have a sort of distinguished co-host here today in an alphabetical order. Beng Tiong or BT. He's the Group CEO and Group Chief Operating Officer for ARA Asset Management. Also joining us is we have David Fassbender, Managing Director of PGIM Investment and Real Estate Investment. And then we have Katrina Newcombe, National Head of Asset Services for Investa. Heng Tan, CEO of Sunway Real Estate Capital. Mako Kit, Managing Director of Ascott Global Service Residence Fund, also business development for Ascott Limited. And then finally, we have Uten Lohachitpitaks, Group Chief Investment Officer for Frasers Property Limited. And so before we kind of jump into our sort of discussion topics, I just want to remind the audience, if you do have a question at any point during the discussion, please post it in the chat function. And then we'll do the best we can to sort of weave that into our discussions. So periodically I'll remind you of that. So with that, let's just dive into the discussion so we can hear from our co-hosts. So I wanted to, maybe the first discussion point was around this concept of real estate as a service. So essentially it's around the evolution of that traditional landlord-tenant relationship becoming more of a service-oriented relationship, service provider to sort of occupier relationship. And, what things are you seeing in that regard in your sort of portfolios? So I might sort of pose this to BT, David and Katrina in particular, and all of you, the others, if you have something to add, please jump in. But I'm curious, based on your roles, maybe BT, start with you. What things are you seeing in this regard?
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a privilege of starting in alphabetical order. Thank you. Yeah. Right. So perhaps I'll frame the question in a broader perspective. I think in the last decade or so, we have seen that in all asset classes, not just real estate, we have seen a shift from ownership to experience or utility. So whether it's your Uber, your WeWork, Airbnb, we have seen that experience is more important than ownership. And in the case of real estate, we are kind of a late starter. But real estate as a service has been evolving in the last few years. But what happened last year was COVID-19 disrupted, and it changed the evolution to, not so much of a revolution, but a near revolution. And it's forcing both users and owners of real estate to relook at the fundamental question, what is real estate? And learning from the other asset classes that I mentioned before, I think it's quite obvious now that we are forced to look at the user's needs in how they want to use real estate. And the topic of today, real estate as a service, is really appropriate. And for us, we operate a big portfolio of office and retail assets across Asia Pacific. In the last few years, we have been moving our real estate from just pure ownership to offices, sorry, to communities. And we have been building portals, we have introduced technology so that the users of our real estate can enjoy the real estate in the form of services, and rather than just brick and mortar. So the dynamics seems to have shifted towards the tenants, and owners are forced to keep up. So, okay, that's my opening shot, and I'm quite happy to hand over to the next panelist. Yeah,
David, any sort of thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything BT said. I think what's really important is for real estate in particular that, which a lot of other industries do, but we should all be doing or have been doing all along, is kind of putting the customer first, right? And the customer here being the tenant most importantly. And I think historically what this has been is just a financial transaction, right? Here's the space, pretty much cookie cutter. You do with this space whatever you want. And these times are definitely over, right? And I think, as BT said, the COVID pandemic has obviously shifted the power structure a little bit, with tenants having a little bit more leverage here, right? So this is just being accelerated. It has been underway for a while. And I think the big landlords that have exposure across all the asset classes, they have seen this shift in other sectors already. And now it has finally arrived in the office space. I think what's challenging, I think, for a lot of landlords, especially I think smaller landlords or mid-sized landlords, maybe landlords that are only focused on office, is kind of have that shifted mindset, which I think you also need with your people that work with you, your asset managers, your transactions people, etc., to really recognize that you need to change the way you work, right? And really think about the tenant and understand the tenant better. Yeah, I think it's an interesting time in real estate, and I think we'll see a lot more happening there. I think we can touch a little bit more on technology later, which I think is at the heart of it, and really the starting point with everything, because everything you've been talking about here really requires a very solid IT backbone and infrastructure across all the assets and your business.
And David, look, PGIM is a massive, asset manager globally, and then you also manage assets, beyond real estate. But when you talk to your colleagues at the other regions, do you get a sense that this real estate as a service is sort of common across the regions? Is there one particular region maybe kind of more mature in this area?
I would say so. I think it's pretty much across the globe. I think here, if you think about it, a lot of some of the markets, you have much more higher concentration of landlords that control certain space, right? So in the office area, whether it's Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, etc., the core assets are in fewer hands, right? Which I think makes a transformation easier and quicker than in other markets, right? And also the assets are much more substantial. If I think about kind of smaller, mid-sized office assets, some of the things we're talking about and we'll be talking about are much harder to implement, right? And I think that's why maybe some of the things you see in Europe or in parts of the US may be a little bit slower. I think Asia is well positioned to kind of drive this change. But I think it's a global phenomenon, not.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting observation, though, about in terms of the concentration of the institutional owners of sort of key properties in CBDs. That's a good point. Katrina, so, I mean, you're actually, of all of us, probably the most sort of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, managing. I mean, Investa has its own buildings they own, but you also provide property management for externally. But so just curious to see here, like, so you may be sort of in that middle space between sort of the tenants and the landlords. So curious to see what you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, look, we are in the middle space, and Investa are an owner and developer of real estate, and we do have some assets we manage for other partners. And some of those partners have global reach. Oxford, who are one of our biggest clients, have global reach. And it's really interesting. I think, David, you touched on the fact that this concept of tenants as a customer and providing real estate as a service really, truly is a global phenomenon. I think in Australia, we've been on the journey for perhaps a little bit longer on some of the technology piece. There are groups out there like Equium who provide different tenant portals that grew from Australia and have then launched themselves from Australia globally. and really providing those sort of tools that we use every day in our asset management. So we have a portal, and we could talk for hours about portals and what they mean and how they work, but it's an app that our tenants use. In some of our buildings, they can use it to enter the building. In some of them, they're using it to order the coffees and book a locker and all those sort of things. And it's amenity to occupiers of our buildings to make their lives easier. And as an head of asset services, so I head up the asset management and the property management teams, I'm always treading this line between this return on investment. You know, how much do we invest in our buildings? How big are our end of trip facilities going to be? How much do I spend on them? How many towels do I provide? All that level of detail. And then how do I actually get that translating into higher rent? Because at the end of the day, we're providing all of this service for two reasons: to retain our tenants and to drive the value of our assets. Retention of tenants is key, particularly in a market like we've had during the COVID time. Without the level of service we've provided to our tenants, we perhaps would have seen a much greater exit of tenants from our buildings, but we've retained our occupancy. We're doing renewals. I mean, the Australian market is quite well ahead of some of the other markets. We're back in offices. We have been for quite a while. Tenants are now looking to the future. They're not looking at that COVID pandemic. Do I really need space? They're looking at, what do I need next? And if we weren't providing service, they'd be walking over the road to another owner. So it's a real must-have now as an owner and a manager, that you have to provide service to tenants. And, you know, they're not tenants anymore. They are customers, and they are true customers. And if we think of them as the old school tenant under the lease, and, you know, the lease is God, then you end up with a situation where you don't retain those customers in your buildings because they don't feel there's the relationship there.
No, that's great. Maybe I'll sort of kind of turn to the others. Like Uten, in terms of when you're, in the market, what things are you seeing?
Well, in the context of real estate as a service.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I will start off with this. I think there are a lot of tech companies out there that we are seeing already in the midst of either redefining themselves, raising fund, and as well as finding real estate partners where they can experiment new concepts around what is it that you can actually do more than just real estate. So, well, I would put it this way: at where we are at Frasers, we spend a lot of time looking at ecosystems company. And the light of what you have seen that we have done is the investment that we have made in companies like Ascott. And they are, of course, in the midst of reinventing themselves too, working with us very closely, where we have towards end last year, launched the first time in Singapore. It's a work anywhere as a workplace solutions that change workplace into not from office, but using any form of real estate, including shopping mall as a workplace, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one form of what we actually did as a partner to Ascott in the real estate as a service. And I like what Katrina just talked about, because today we have to really look at adding that services to our investment strategy. It's no longer looking at every square inch or square foot of real estate that you can turn into just collect rent. We have to turn locations of that space into amenities, more services, as customer will not even come to you or won't even stay with you if you don't do that as a service anymore, right? So then the question, of course, as you ask about what do we see, is also the challenge of landlord and real estate developers and investors like us. Do we allocate that amenity space, operate it on our own, or we find a partner who know how to do it and bring them in to help us in our customer retention? And it becomes part and parcel of our new strategies going forward. And that changes a lot of our calculations in the investment strategies too.
Sure. Maybe just shift the discussion slightly, but still same, real estate as a service. Maybe sort of Heng or Ho Kit, your assets, you both have sort of serviced accommodation, service residence sort of in your portfolio. In that asset class, I have to imagine that's always been part of it, but do you see it sort of evolving further? Just curious to hear about sort of, because I think we've talked a lot about sort of commercial real estate and office space, but applying that now, so do you see that also in your assets? In that
maybe
sort of
I
service
can.
accommodation?
Maybe I'll just start briefly. I mean, just to share with everyone experience. And about a year, slightly more than a year, about a year and a half ago, we've been actually investing into a particular asset class, which is very much a student accommodation sector, which to us is also partly a hospitality. And although, and I agree with Katrina, your tenants are your customers. In this case, your tenants, every single undergraduate or postgraduate student, and they are actually our customers as well. And also to link back to what BT mentioned, in terms of community. And we also realize that it's just not providing a single, whatever, a 20 square meter room to the student, but it's very much in terms of student accommodation, it's experience. I think we touched on this issue of our customer experience, and we realize how important basically to create a whole ecosystem of an experience and community to the students. And as what Uten mentioned, how to retain them, especially for the next year or another 2 more years, depending on how many years that they've got in terms of their education period with the university. And I mean, simple things like, and I think Katrina touched on technology, and we also realize how important technology is. I mean, very simple things like, and this COVID experience was something, a real big experience for us. I mean, we never realized how important a huge flat screen, a flat screen TV or flat screen LCD you put into the student accommodation is critical to the students until when you realize that they have to take all the lessons online. And just this little bit tweaking of, if you can call it, asset enhancement or refurbishment added a lot of value to the students, because from their own personal experience, it's like, wow, I need this because I'm going to take all my lessons online, and you need the bigger flat screen. So yeah, I mean, this is a kind of a real anecdotal kind of personal experience we felt, especially during this particular COVID period, and how, as I think what all the other speakers mentioned, it's very much a customer experience, and it's experiential learning or experiential outcome, which is what they're looking for. Maybe Ho-Kit can elaborate, especially from Ascott's perspective.
I think most of the points are touched on, but I just want to elaborate on 2 particular points, which is something that we are subscribed to very much and we are very passionate about. So one of the points made was retention, and 2, I think Heng mentioned ecosystem. So we have always looked at that from that perspective, right? Because this whole evolution of real estate, because real estate is not traditionally as how we perceive it as just being a hard brick and mortar. Because at the end of the day, at the direction and at what the users are asking for, whatever we build, no matter how beautiful a building, no matter how good a service, no matter how good a location, at the end of the day, it must have the end user in mind. And this end user is the tenant or the guest that's going to stay there, right? Without having that in mind, then whatever you do is only good, and it will only last for the trend of the day. Right, so, and that's what we will always try to look at. But of course, COVID has accelerated all of this, right? In many of the things that we do, different players, different groups have been making small steps, but COVID has forced a much more rapid adoption. And it all goes towards how we captivate the end user, how we capture an enduring relationship with them to build long-lasting loyalty. Right, and that is very important. So what we have been doing in very small steps, we now apply it across the board in looking at our space, not just from every per square meter, not just from every user, but you see, if you can segmentize it to multiple use points for multiple people at different times of the day, whether some of the things that we have done, we use our apartments as work offices, which was very well received. And we didn't know how well it would go, because people have been doing that pre-COVID, right? But during COVID, obviously that took off big time, because you can't go to offices and not many people have the luxury of a nice quiet home or room where you can work from. And then, they go to these apartments to work, and you have got a big enough space, and depending on the budget, you could have a suite room, you could have a larger room, you could have a smaller hotel room. And this is something that we do, right? And other things that how we cater, and these things that we do for multiple users is actually beneficial for both the property itself, for the existing guests, as well as we've discovered actually new users to our space. One of the things that also caught us and which was pretty much a high take up was, people booking these apartments to conduct streaming classes, whether it is yoga, it's exercise, or it is a cooking class. So I think there is a lot more to that. And from our own guest perspective, and they appreciate this experience very much, because it is not just booking a nice hotel or a nice service apartment to stay at, and suddenly this thing that are being packaged for, you can actually treat it as a service as additional, is value enhancing for these people, for our guests.
Great. No, that's both are very interesting observations. Everything from just simple things like installing flat screens in all the sort of student accommodation rooms and the value that brings, especially with, all the classes being online. And then, Hope, your example of finding a whole set of new users for your service to residences. So, one of the things along those lines in terms of, finding new users, kind of that mix where, maybe the traditional, brick and mortar approach was, okay, you build a building, let's say just take commercial office for a moment, and, you lease out the units, and, you have your pro forma on how much sort of rental and, income you can generate, and so on and so forth. But when, with this real estate as a service, and we touched on it a little bit, which is around co-working. I think, Uten, you mentioned Jesco, but, here in Singapore, I do see, Capital Land and other sort of RQM looking at sort of taking a floor and turning it into flex space, not necessarily co-working for the market, but for their tenants. And then other amenities and so on and so forth. Some of it they charge for, however they recover the costs of, but, providing those as a service, an attraction and retention tool for the tenants and their assets. But if we kind of shift our view now toward an investment, kind of, investing in assets, and, maybe David, I'll kind of turn to you a little bit on this one. As you look at sort of investing in assets and you look at your portfolio, do you start taking consideration of those sort of, fixed revenue sources and sort of, variable, revenue sources and the valuation of the assets and so on?
Well, I think from an investment perspective, I think there are two things, and it kind of depends on what we're looking at. I feel like one, if you're talking about small kind of mid-sized assets, right? Not that flexible components are not important there. Yes, you need to think about them, but some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of tenant engagement, et cetera, I think to me that's still more in the large grade A type space.
Okay.
But I would say I actually think what's happening is for a lot of real estate investors, especially in the kind of the value add space, is an opportunity. And is an opportunity because the investments you have to make in your assets, right? And the ability to manage not just long fixed term leases, but shorter leases, or the flexibility that comes with having maybe a co-working operator that now none of them leases the space anymore, right? They all want management contracts. So you really got to work with them. So being able to actually handle all that, make the investments, manage the different types of leases, do all the rollover, engage with your tenants, not everyone can do that. There's a lot of corporate owners out there of office buildings that are just not set up to do that. There's a lot of smaller or mid-sized owners that are not set up to do this. So I think for the larger established managers, it's an opportunity to buy undermanaged assets, really, and whether it's just refurbishment or just repositioning with an experienced management team, making the right investments in technology, et cetera. I think that's a great opportunity. So from an investment perspective, we really like this transformation because we think we can be that investor that can make that difference. I think one part of your question was like, how do you deal with the variability of income, right? I think generally in Asia, maybe Australia is a little bit of an exception, but generally in Asia, leases are very short anyway, right? So a lot of the landlords have to be able to deal with a relatively large amount of turnover every year anyway, right? I think that's much more of a problem for other markets like Europe and the US, right? Because I firmly believe that leases for 10, 15 years or longer are going to go away, right? I really don't think anyone, you can't expect that that's the majority of the leases that are being done, right? And that again plays into what I said earlier, you got to be set up to handle this.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Maybe in terms of just the setup and being able to manage that, maybe, David, I think what you also were touching on is a little bit the scale of the buildings and where this makes sense or not. So I think, in your experience, is there sort of a cutoff or a type of asset where you say, you know what, this doesn't really apply?
Well, maybe Katrina is better placed to answer that. I personally think that, if you have, you need, it's not just the size of the building, it's the number of tenants you have. I think it's also ideally it's a mixed use asset in my mind, because if you really want to make a difference to your tenants, you kind of integrate the different components within the building, right? And allow access for your retail tenants to the office population and all this, right? I mean, and Katrina touched on some of that. If you have a smaller building with like 5 tenants, even if it's a large building in itself in its physical form, not sure that really makes that much of a difference, right? But I do think, and that's something I think will take time. But for smaller buildings or mid-sized buildings, creating kind of for landlords collaborating, working together to kind of creating a precinct, right? And maybe have a tenant engagement app across all of that, right? That could solve some of these problems and be actually quite interesting. But it requires collaboration, right? And we all know how difficult that is to get that going between competing landlords, the sharing of information, etc. But ideally, I think this is kind of the future where you can have that engagement, have that service also across a bunch of small or mid-sized assets.
Sure. Well, Katrina, on that point, what's your view on that?
Yeah, look, I think David's right. For smaller assets, it's hard to really drive that tenant engagement, to bring in all the tools and the bells and whistles that go with it, because it just doesn't stack up. So we have some smaller buildings in our portfolio and have had historically. Some of those have recently been sold, where they're more sort of B grade assets, perhaps, talking in my Aussie lingo of square meters, the sub 20,000 square meter size. And it's really hard to start bringing in tools like apps, which have a base foundation cost to just build and put in your building. It's hard to have a concierge because you've got to pay for a full-time person to sit in your building. That costs money. You need more square meters to make that affordable across your assets. So we tend to treat those assets a little bit differently. We drive the customer service at those assets through our on-site facility manager and our property manager really being the people that have to work very hard. And we do have end of trip facilities in every one of our assets. And we try where we can, no matter how big or small the asset is, to really activate the lobby. And we can squeeze cafes into pretty small spots, providing we can get a bit of plumbing and some electrical there. You can have a cafe operator, and us Aussies love our morning latte or espresso. So, tenants coming into a building actually expect that. They expect that I can come to my building and I can get a coffee, if not in the lobby, just around the corner, really close by. So those little things you can do in smaller assets, but the bigger things, the apps, the big community driving tenant events, you do need a larger building and a larger community. I think David also touched on the number of tenants in a building. We do have great success with some buildings where there are very few tenants, but we have a lot of occupants because they're 40,000 square meter buildings. We've got one building we manage in Sydney with Telstra as the main occupant of the building. We've been able to put our app in there. We've been able to run tenant engagement activities because the occupants coming to work every day still like to have that experience. They expect to be able to come ride their bike to work and have a shower in a really luxurious end of trip facility. And if you don't provide that, they get grumpy with their bosses and say, well, my friend's got that down the road. Why are we at this building? So there's a lot of peer group pressure around that. And the Australian market's been doing pretty luxurious end of trip facilities for the last decade now, but it's gone up another notch. You're now talking millions of dollars of investment into end of trip facilities and having to redo those every 5 to 7 years to just keep up with the trends and the demands and the bike racks that go with it, the towels that go with it, the cleaning regime that goes with those, particularly in a COVID and post-COVID environment that we've got. But they're the expectations that tenants have. It's that hotel service. When I come to work each day, I want to feel that this is somewhere I want to be. And because we generally provide those facilities across our assets, we've had great occupancy of people coming back into our buildings in a world where the governments in Australia are now saying it's safe, go back to work. But employers and particularly global companies are still saying, I'm not going to force you to go back in. So we as managers and owners of assets need to be making our assets really exciting and enticing so those employees want to come back to work. They want to go and get their coffee from the barista that knows their name in the morning in the lobby. They want to ride their bike in and park it in a lovely spot and have their shower. All those things have become so important in this time. And that is what drives our tenant retention. That is what drives our ability to get good rents in a market. But we do have a predominantly A-grade and premium grade portfolio in capital cities. So we're not talking smaller assets in regional locations.
Right. No, I mean, you touched on an important point there, which maybe I wanted to ask BT about, which is in sticking with this theme around from an investment perspective. Clearly you own an asset, and I think you have good examples of that. Suntec. I think there's something called the Southgate complex in Melbourne, where you have invested in upgrading over a period of time to improve the experience, retention. Walk us through a little bit of how you do that calculation, because some of these improvements, like Katrina said, is millions of dollars, right? And so take us through that sort of thought process, BT.
Right. Okay. Those couple of projects you mentioned are pretty large scale mixed development, and these are very good palette to work with. It's like a very big canvas that we can do lots and lots of things. And for using Suntec City as example, since many years ago, we have started an app, and this app allows us to build communities. And with the app, we have done lots of things. For example, community events, portals where people can give feedback. We embedded a loyalty program into the mall and subsequently extended it to the office occupiers. So the technology has enabled us to create a community for both office and retail tenants and shoppers. And it is always evolving, and we keep adding on services to make the whole property interesting for both shoppers and office occupiers. But going back to your first question that you asked, David, the investments that we made, we don't see it as giving us an immediate return, but it's a long game. And if you imagine now with what we have done to Suntec City, we're able to get $1 extra on the rent. So it is not the revenue coming from the small ancillary services, but it's $1 we're getting on the rent. And for 1 million square foot office property, that is a lot of revenue. So, and to add on to that, over time, we increased the number of properties in our Singapore portfolio. And what we have learned in Suntec City, we are rolling out to the other properties. And the incremental cost for each property is quite minimal. So imagine creating an office portal for Suntec City. We could replicate the same for the other properties. And for all the community services that we build in Suntec City, we can actually extend the same services to the occupiers in the other buildings. So to David's point, scale helps a lot. And over time, the cost of building all these services and the tech will keep coming down. But over time, the contribution to the rent will keep going up. So it's really a long game for us. Yeah.
Okay. And so,
and June,
you,
just
go ahead.
sorry, no, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think in addition to retention and higher rents, I think there's a lot of potential revenue sources that probably none of us can really think about just yet. Because if you think about this, what all of us have in our assets is a huge platform, right? That historically has just been used to collect rent, nothing else. If you compare that with how platforms are used, virtual platforms, with a Facebook or otherwise, there's so many different revenue streams, right? And I think this industry has there's a lot of potential to really think this through, connect all the dots, create really a product across multiple products across this platform and generate actually additional revenue. So I don't think it's just all horrible, lots of costs being spent and stuff, and we're getting nothing in return. I think there is additional revenue in the mid to long term here.
Right, and David, I think just to add on to David's point, he just reminded me of something. Of all the things that we have done, one of the best things that came out is the data we are collecting. Data on the shoppers, data on the tenants, and all this will contribute to all the services that we are going to provide in the future. It will contribute to how we think about real estate, how we redesign the building, how we do the building upgrading. So it's really a virtuous circle that we are creating.
Yeah.
I just want to add, if I may, in the return and the cost, they are obviously important. But I think all these things that are being done, it is a longer term. And like BT talked about the data, I think that there's a lot you can harvest from there, to see what other services that you could put back for the guests who are coming in. In these things that you're offering, you actually could attract a lot more guests. And in the case of retail, a lot more footfalls. Right? They would eventually lead to a higher rent, but there are also other avenues that you could look at how to cater to these additional people in the case of a mall, or the additional people in the case of an office building, or in a service apartment or hotel, that there are other avenues that you could harvest them in many other areas. Like earlier on, I was sharing that I wanted to just fill the space in COVID as a space, as a service to cater to multiple users. But the indirect benefit that we got from it was that the rest of the ecosystem of the people who are in that facility are enjoying it and how they appreciate it. And this actually builds to a longer loyalty and the retention that they will come back.
No, absolutely. And then, just maybe the final maybe question around that sort of investment, cost and benefit. Uten, clearly, if you're looking to invest and do these upgrades and to enhance experience and so on and so forth, surely, you must have to go through investment committee and but do you go through that same kind of long-term thinking that?
Yeah, well, clearly there will be quite a fair bit of things. And I just want to maybe touch on a few variable subjects that we consider at our end. Of course, fresh off our mind, and it's all about COVID-19. How do you keep your property safe, your tenants safe, your customers safe, your traffic safe, right? So we started a lot of, how do we connect, building on the point that David just talked about in building a platform. For example, in Frasers, we launched Makan Masters with the intentions of getting tenants to be able to order food and not having to queue, as queue expose them longer at the retail shops or at the F&B shops. So you order, you go in, you pick up, you go. Yeah, in a way, it also creates convenience. But as we think about that, it's not just about safety, as David also talked about, right? So it is about building a platform, add-on as a service. So that part of the benefit versus cost that you just talked about, in our mind, the priority actually ranked above everything else was safety. And we actually focus on that. Now, then benefits also is not just on about short term. The question is also what happens after COVID-19? Do we maintain it? Do we keep running it? Right? Because it is going to be a cost to us, and we don't expect that we will profit from it. Now, obviously, that has now evolved as a business model. So we self-search and we discovered that yes, with more data, with more understanding and insights of the customers, we are now evolving that model into something else. As what we have done in the launch of Switch, which is a work anywhere solution together with Just Close in our shopping mall, we now are seeing more traffic coming in, and we like it that the shoppers don't come to our mall just for shopping anymore, but it's to work. And it now also further has evolved into a more workplace solutions. It's not anymore we're going to market ourselves as office for rent, right? But it's a workplace solutions that is now tailored to customers who are looking at maybe scaling up, scaling down. They want flexibility. They want people to fund the fit out because they may not have the budget to fund fit out anymore. And what if they have shadow space? How do they actually release of those shadow space? So these workplace solutions as a new service has been designed around solving problems and pain points for our customers. And obviously, we actually put out as a digital platform too, connecting like Switch, connecting office leasing, flex leasing, and as well as co-working seats together with our operating partners and package that as a solution to tenants. So that model, I think, as you talk about what is cost and benefit, is under a lot of pilot and testing at the moment. We don't know too whether core and flex is going to stay after we end COVID, or whether the world can end COVID, and whether companies will all come back to work and sort of abandon the concept of work from home or work anywhere, right? So it's an evolution that we're going to experience going forward.
Yeah, I think everyone's waiting to see what that model is going to look like, but I think that actually it's quite interesting. People are starting to look more and more at Australia and seeing how that's evolving. And I think what we're seeing a lot, at least from our perspective, looking at occupiers, is that, I think the feedback from employees is that flexibility is key. I think that everyone does want to have a portion of the week back in the office, but clearly they want that flexibility. So yeah, I think we'll see some hybrid, but so anyway, the last topic is really, getting to that sort of weaving hospitality into real estate. We talk, I think all of us touched on a little bit here and there on it, but maybe start out from, from that sort of the folks on this call that are sort of more closely doing literal, hospitality, service accommodation, hotels, and have experience in that area. Do you see any application of what you do to commercial space or retail space? And maybe let's start with you, Heng.
Yeah, I think with regards to, from our perspective, and we also have office developments, and we do at times try and impart some of these services in our hotels or even in our student accommodations, so hospitality to the offices. And to us, I think one thing that stood up very well was very much in terms of concierge services, especially during this current, or rather during the peak period of the COVID scenarios. And I mean, we may all laugh about it, but how some of hotels would turn into dedicated facilities for stay home for 14 days or whatever number of days. We were amazed at how important concert services was, especially when the guys in the room can't even get out. So I mean, these were all really anecdotal experiences that we learned along the way, and that actually, to be honest, was a bit of impetus for us to sort of improve on our concert services and to see how important that is. And that's basically to them is to us, even though they may be there because of a dedicated stay-home facility. But at least to us, we treat every one of them as a customer. I mean, we never know. They may come back to the hotel when things are back to normal. And these are actually our customers or potential customers to some extent. And to us, therefore, we look at it very much as a customer service and as well as a concierge service.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hokid, as part of Ascott, one of the things Ascott is really known for, it's its service, and I think they even have a service academy and so on. Have you there's some good training and training practices that should be applied to sort of people managing buildings, commercial buildings?
Yeah, actually we do, and of course our training academy, we provide this type of training to the larger industry as well. So all these hospitality practices actually is not new. It's being applied to different extent, to different parts of the real estate. We talk about like office, it's very common nowadays. You go to a Grade A office building, you see a concierge below. Of course, Katrina talked about it's a function of scale, whether a function of cost, but you have this in residential as well, in a very high-end luxury residential apartments. You have a concierge, right? So I think it's a price point, it is a tier, it's a brand, it's a category, it's a segment to different extent that is being provided. But the short answer is yes, there are a lot of things that can be applied and shared across, because at the end of the day, it is a human dealing with another human. So to expect some form of a service to enhance, to elevate the end user, whether it's a guest, a tenant, or retail shopper, is very important, because if we can enhance that experience, all the various things that we talk about through different forms, different tools that can be applied, that comes in handy, and that builds towards a loyalty and a retention. At the end of the day, that is what we are all hoping for. We provide the best service to address the end user needs, and they like what you offer, and they come back and they stay again. So it is a win-win for the end user, the customer, the operator, and the landlord.
Yeah. I mean, clearly that's a real mind shift, and it's sort of in terms of, especially for property managers or sort of asset managers. And maybe, Katrina, there's actually a question from the audience, and maybe throw it to you a little bit. In the buildings that you manage, in terms of different generations within the building, or sort of employees of occupiers, in terms of when we say, we've talked about experiences and different services and apps, and do you see whether there's, do you observe by generation that, they're looking for a particular thing, or they're more apt to use the technology, or do you see any of that by generation?
A little bit. I would say the younger generation are more early adopters of the apps in our buildings. It tends to be younger females that are the early adopters. But it goes right through. We run all sorts of prizes and competitions through our tenant apps, and it's part of driving community, and particularly during COVID when people were working from home, it was a reminder that you do have an office building back here. And the prizes, Christmas time might have been a hamper to their home. And, you can tell by the people that win those comps, it is males, it is females, it is all ages. So people are engaging at all ages. It depends. When we run social functions, it does depend on the function that we're running as to what level of person you sort of attract. And so we do tend to go a little bit more bespoke there, and we will run different functions to suit senior execs, and then there'll be functions that are more social, have a drink, or a coffee and a cupcake in the lobby, or something that is aimed at just anybody walking in who thinks they might have a spare 5 minutes in their morning. But you'd be really quite surprised at the number of more mature people, and I'm one of those more mature people that you would say you probably wouldn't be on the app, but they do. And during COVID, we were running things like yoga and Pilates classes through our app. We're still running those, even though we've got a lot of people back in our buildings. They like the fact that we're providing them with this service that's free to them, that they can do anywhere. When we can, we do face-to-face classes. For the fitness classes, the running groups attract more men. The Pilates and yoga classes, surprise, surprise, attract more women, but they're of all ages. And the only way you can book those is through our app. So I think there's not as big a generational divide here as what perhaps you think there would be. And it has been a bit surprising to us, but also good for us.
That's great. So do you see any particular sort of amenity or service you've provided in your buildings that sort of kind of, you get sort of really good feedback on what are more popular than others?
Surprisingly, people, well, maybe not surprisingly, people love free stuff. So whether it's a free food, in summer, we often do gelato carts in our lobbies. It's a bit of fun. It's an hour, perhaps early in the afternoon on a hot summer's day, and everybody walking in the building will be queuing up for their free gelato, and probably a few that don't actually work in the buildings as well. So we find free things are very, very appealing. But it creates a sense of fun, and you'll get a group of people from one of your tenants coming down all together to get that free thing. Or for International Women's Day in one of our buildings, the building I'm actually sitting in tonight, we ran a photo comp, and there were lots of groups of people coming down and doing silly photos of what it means to be a woman in today's world. And it was males, it was females, and it was groups coming down from our tenants for a bit of fun. Workplaces are very serious places. So as managers, we like to provide a little bit of fun and excitement and experience. So it's not all about work all day, every day. And that's a very big shift from when I entered property management 30 years ago. It was about collecting the rent and making sure the buildings were clean and the lifts worked. Now they're just things that happen almost in the background, and we use the data to make all of that happen smoothly. And now, I've got a head of occupant experience. I hired one 2 years ago now. We hadn't had one before, but we said we need someone in here to curate our occupant experience. And then we've got a team that sits under that person. These are the big shifts in what we're doing to engage with our clients, even when we're recruiting our staff from property management or facilities management, much more focus on not so much their technical skills. We used to look for, the FM that had engineering background and could actually do things in the building. Now you're looking for the facilities manager who's well presented, who's articulate, and who can have a conversation with occupants about things that are going wrong with the building. And if they can't do that, they're actually not really very good FMs in our world. Because the technicians that work for the air conditioning contractors and the lift contractors, they're technical, they're behind the scenes, but my team are all client facing, and they have to be presentable and be able to communicate. So we run a lot of communication skills training. We have had customer service specific training. We've had concierge-led training. Our buildings didn't all have concierge even 5 years ago. Only your really top-end premium assets would have concierge. Now we have concierge in every one of our buildings through to our A-grade assets. And it's expected that there will be somebody there, and it's not a security guard at a front desk like it used to be, handing out an access card with a grumpy face. Now it's the person smiling and welcoming you, knowing the names of some of the people, helping you get theatre tickets and restaurant bookings and all sorts of things. That's sort of the big shift in service we've seen. And those things appeal to anybody of all ages and all genders.
Okay, no, definitely. I think the way everyone smiled at this, I think we'd be victims of that as well. But there's a question here, actually, maybe just going back to talking a little bit about sort of, revenue sources and so on. I don't know if Uten, if you wanted to take that on, or, are there, when you think about co-working or sort of having flex spaces one way, but are there other sort of sources for sort of ancillary service or ancillary revenue? I guess.
Yeah, so we thought about that from the standpoint of the impact of COVID. Maybe I'll just touch on that, and I'll relate that about how do I actually build it up to additional revenue to our properties. We started off things like how do we make our property safe, make it contactless, add on more services to make sure that the tenants and the members of the users are all happy and safe to come back to office or retail or our properties. Right. So during COVID, mid of last year, the first thing that we launched as in response to COVID was a UVC robots that can help to clean air furniture surfaces using UVC light. That was made as part of our property disinfection process, but as it turns out, we also have got tenants and as well as other customers outside of our property network calling us for the same assistance of service. And we offer that as an incremental revenue to what we do. That being one. Then I guess two was we also thought of, yes, contactless, and in part of that, people coming back to a property may not want to see people or have a lot more of like touch point of interface. So end of last year, we launched robotic coffee, cocktail, tea, and drinks. So the concept of that started us thinking about if we have an office concierge, all right, with a service manager manning the space. Number one, can we convert that into a revenue space? Can we add on more service? Can it be contactless? Can it be safe? So the solutions around robotic cocktail coffee became the wow and experience factor that helped the service managers to double up managing that robot, which is self and autonomous in its own running. Connect everything by mobile phone. So you order, you can pay all contactless. And as well as, you have the service manager that is not incremental cost to us to again double up as an incremental revenue to the building, not just on a cost base, right? So those were on our mind to think of, but obviously started off from how do we make it safe for the benefits of our customers first, but as it evolved, it now has become a revenue and a new business model to us. And we are helping other landlord properties in converting this, making non-revenue space to be revenue space.
Sure, well, that's a good point.
June, maybe just one point on this. I think you have to start with, okay, what data do I actually have, right? Or what data can I collect, right? And then think about what are revenue sources that come with that, right? And there's obviously some concerns around confidentiality potentially and privacy, et cetera. But if you look at a tenant app, right, and all the information that it can potentially collect about the person that uses it when it comes to the office, where it goes for lunch, what it orders through the app, right, who it engages with, right, et cetera. Potentially even where the person lives and how the person gets to work, right? There's a lot of very interesting data, and really what you're creating is customer profiles, right? Like every good hotel on the planet would have, their top customers would understand them, would know when they come, et cetera, right? And that data is valuable, and you can sell that. Now, whether you want that and whether your tenants want you to do that is another question. But potentially, there's huge money in that type of data, and I think that's something you will see over the next few years play out. I think in real estate.
Yeah, and I guess what you're saying is sort of using that data then also to inform like what the needs are and demand is. Right?
It's not one-sided at all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it can be for your retail tenants. It could be super interesting to know what's the kind of demographics of the people here in the building, right? I mean, it works for both sides. It's not one-sided, but
sure.
You can obviously take it to the extreme.
No, absolutely. I wish we had more time, and we have 2 minutes left, and I really wanted to thank the audience who's joined us today, but also really thank the co-hosts here today. And I wish we had more time because to go through each of your businesses and your companies, because it's actually quite an interesting cross-section, one of asset classes, scale, markets, got covered a little bit of everything. So, hopefully there's an opportunity to do that down the road, but wanted to really thank all of you. And really, I think one of the key sort of takeaways for me anyway was, in terms of what's driving sort of this real estate as a service is definitely, the fundamental things like retaining and attracting tenants, enhancing the value and getting sort of, higher rent or, revenue. And then also there was a safety factor that Uten sort of brought up, which is quite important, especially given what we went through or going through still. And then I think the really good point, David, you brought up was around, this is a building, but it's also a platform, especially you have an asset across, multiple properties. And I think BT, you've done that with Suntech. Katrina, you've touched that on some of the properties you manage. And then, Heng on, that unique, the student housing and Hokid sort of with your sort of Ascott properties. I think really, you have this, it's almost like it's a captive audience, and then sort of, drawing sort of, applying sort of the digital strategy to that, right? So I think that was a really sort of interesting takeaway. So with that, really wanted to thank all of you for the time that you took today to participate in this. So thank you very much.